So I wanted to focus today on a particular aspect of negotiation, and whether you're talking about negotiating a deal or resolving a dispute, I think this is something that's really helpful. And I want to start, are we, okay. So I want to start with a roadmap for what I'm going to cover today. So part one is going to be called "You're Everything That's Wrong with America." Part two is on Dwight Schrute, McDonald's, and the sexist video. And part three is this fishbowl we call life. So in part one, we're going to talk about the problem with perspective. Part two, we're going to talk about some things we can do about it. And then part three, if we have time, we're going to practice a couple of things, putting that stuff into practice. So jumping into part one, you're everything that's wrong with America. So there is an image that was, I think it was on the New York Times back maybe several months, a year ago. And it's an optical illusion. And as you look at this, A and B are actually the same color, those squares. And the way the shading of this looks, they look like they're not the same colors, right? So take a look at that and see if you can, if you look hard enough, if you can see how that they might be the same color. Does anybody see the same color, or does it still look very different?
Black and white. The letter A and the letter B, not the squares behind.
Right. Yeah, and that's a good clarification. Not the letter A and B, but the squares that they're on are the same color. Okay. So what I've done is the next few slides, I'm zooming in on it to help you maybe see that. So here's a tighter shot. Anybody see it yet? Here's an even tighter shot.
Close your eyes, and it all happens.
See it? Yeah, sometimes you have to really, really focus. Here's an even tighter shot. You starting to see it? Anyone? Okay. And then this last slide is going to show just the squares themselves broken out, which at that point it becomes really obvious, right? But this is the same as those two squares. Just kind of weird, right? Because the first slide, they clearly look, somebody said it's black and white. I mean, it seems so obvious if somebody just puts this in front of you. Clearly, they're not the same square. But as you start focusing in, you can see, at least here, I think we can all see that they're the same color. So the radio program, This American Life, did a short piece about this, and we're going to listen to that clip and then talk about some of it. You have audio?
Okay, so I'll just pause here for a second for something that is so rare on public radio, or, I guess anywhere actually. Let's pause for something that everyone can agree on. Something that doesn't divide Republicans and Democrats, Sunni and Shia, Taylor Swift fans and Katy Perry fans. There's something that I found like that everybody can agree on is a graphic. It's a graphic that somebody showed me on the internet. It's an optical illusion created by a professor at MIT who studies vision and the brain. And basically, there are two gray boxes. One of them is surrounded by lighter stuff, so it looks darker. And the other gray box is surrounded by darker stuff, so it looks lighter. But in fact, the whole point of it is it's an optical illusion. The two gray squares are exactly the same shade of gray. Now, that's just a fact. But of course, since this graphic is on the internet, there's a comment section. And you might think, what would you possibly comment on, right? It doesn't seem like there's anything really here to discuss. Gray is gray. And I'll refrain from a 50 Shades of Grey joke here and just say, when you scroll down through the comments, people do find a way to disagree, even about this. And I don't know, maybe you've been on the internet. They like to curse about it. One person writes, what a load of... They are different colors. Another writes, not the same shade. Says a third, not convinced. Then people start in with advice. And at first, they're like super nice about it, right? They're trying to be helpful. They tell the doubters to take their fingers and cover over everything but the 2 gray squares on their screen. And they'll see they are the same color. Several people suggest that they can open up the file in Photoshop or MS Paint and use the dropper tool to see the exact RGB values of the colors. And they'll see that they're the same. By the way, 120, 120, 120 with 160 hue, 113 bloom. After all of that, somebody still writes, the second square looks brighter to me. Somebody else replies, it's definitely brighter than you. Stupid, which of course leads to the kind of big, overbroad, sweeping statement you see in comment sections everywhere. Quote, if after reading this thread, you refuse to actually test it and choose to stick with your dogmatic belief, then you are everything that is wrong with America.
Okay. So we have this collective problem of being able to ineffectively respond to each other when we have different perspectives on things. Even if you are right, in this case, there's a right answer. But what I want to talk to you guys about today is what happens when what do we do when we have this difference in perspective, and especially if we were so certain we're right. So there was to kind of follow up on this. There's a debate that broke out several months ago, global debate, a really contentious issue, and was kind of dividing families and friends, and perhaps you also got dragged into this debate. And the question was, what colors are the dress? So who sees blue and black? Raise your hand. Okay, and who sees white and gold?
Weird.
Okay, so those of you who see white and gold, what's going on with the people who see blue and black? Are they mentally deficient somehow? They're not as bright?
With Lauren and Logan, I heard that it has to do something between like male and female brains, and males have better ability to see in the nighttime because like evolutionary they had to protect women in the night, so their night vision's better, so they see it in black and white. Things in the day better, so they see it as gold and white. I don't know. And the 2 people who raised their hand for gold and white were women in this class, so.
Wow. That's probably the most sophisticated explanation I've heard. I don't know if that's right.
So much in my marriage, it's not even funny. Like, it's bad.
So white and gold people see something very different than blue and black people. We're looking at the same image here, right? And whether we're in Salt Lake, Logan, Moab, wherever, we're looking at the same image, and some people are seeing it one way and some people are seeing it a different way. Do you know what color it is in real life? If we brought this woman in her dress and stood her before the whole class, do you know what color the dress actually is? It's black and blue. It's a blue and black dress. And if she were here, you would all see that the way the photo is and the lighting of the photo. Some people see white and gold, some people see blue and black. It doesn't mean that if you see white and gold that you are somehow mentally deficient or colorblind or anything else. It has nothing to do with your intelligence or what kind of person you are. It's just the lighting and the way the brain works, and maybe it's some complicated thing about men and women and how they see at night or whatever. Funny thing is, I see blue and gold. Which I don't know what that means, but the point is there's a right answer here, even though reasonable people can see it differently. It is a blue and black dress in real life, so there's a right answer, but reasonable people can see it differently. Now, a different type of question is raised by this illusion, which I think many people have seen. Has anybody not seen this one? If you've not seen this, raise your hand. I can't. Oh, a few people have not. Okay. So those of you who have not seen it, what do you see here? Is this an old woman or a young woman?
Probably a young woman looking away from the camera or the whatever's taking the picture.
Okay, so you see a young woman.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen it before and you see an old woman, raise your hand. Everybody who hasn't seen it before only sees a young woman. So if somebody told you this is actually an old woman, what would you think?
I don't see it.
So are they crazy? I mean, it's not a middle-aged woman, right? She's either pretty young or very old. So what do you say to
Can't
somebody
see
who
it.
says, no, who says you're wrong, it's not a young woman, it's an old woman? What would you say?
I don't see it. I don't see the old woman at all.
And you're trying, right?
Yeah.
It's not that you're not trying. Somebody says this is an old woman, but all you see is a young woman.
The black line
So-
across.
So the old woman, you see the young woman, right? Well, here's the old woman. This is her nose. It's a big nose. This is her mouth. Her chin is kind of tucked down into her chest a little bit. This is her eye here. Do you see that? Big nose, a mouth, a chin, and an eye. Now, do you see that? Do you see the old woman yet? In Moab?
Stretch.
We still don't see it. Samantha and
Okay.
I are on the same boat, and we still don't see it.
Okay. Which is interesting, right? Because even as I'm pointing it out to you, still difficult to see. Now, the interesting thing about this image, as opposed to the blue and black dress, is there's actually a right answer. There's not one right answer. If you see a young woman, you're correct. If you see an old woman, you are also correct. It's both an old woman and a young woman. Now, the thing that I'm interested in is not who's right, but how do we respond to people when we see it differently? And the problem is we tend to look at all issues as blue-black dress issues. There's a right answer and I have it. But what if it's a young woman, old woman problem? How can I be certain that I have the right answer? And in life, that's what happens. Sometimes there is a blue-black dress issue, right? There is a right answer. Maybe I have that right answer. But that doesn't solve my problem because reasonable people can see white and gold. And if I'm trying to negotiate some deal or dispute, it doesn't help to just sit there and hammer on my point that it's blue and black. Why can't you see that? The other thing is I really don't know if it's a blue-black dress problem. What if it's an old woman, young woman problem? And I'm hammering on it as if it's a blue-black dress problem. Still doesn't solve my problem. So what we're going to talk about today is what do we do about this perspective issue? So we have blue-black dress problems, we have young woman, old woman problems, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if we actually have the right answer because we got this other person we're dealing with and we need to create some kind of agreement. For those of you who couldn't see the old woman, if you Google the image, they have some different versions of it where they make it more clear that how you can look and see the old woman a little more clearly than the young woman.
We did
So
that,
if
yeah,
you're,
Brennan
you got
did
it,
that, and
okay.
we see it now, yeah.
all good. Okay. All right, so here's our perspective problem is we have an inability to see more than our own perspective. It's easy to see our own perspective, and we think that we have the right perspective. And if you don't share my perspective, then you're wrong. And maybe you're misguided, but often, I start attributing really horrible things to you because you don't share my perspective, whatever the issue might be. So how does this relate to negotiation? Well, when we look at the definition of negotiation, this is Justice Potter Stewart, and he's a Supreme Court judge who gave a famous definition of pornography that maybe you've heard of. Anybody know what he said? He says, this is what pornography is. He says, how do you define pornography? He says, you know it when you see it, right? That's Stewart's definition of pornography. So some people might define negotiation as that, right? It's this thing that I know what it is when I see it, but maybe it's harder to define. So how would you describe, if you were asked to define what negotiation is, how would you describe it? Kind of tough, right? Even though we've all done it, you've all negotiated, even within the last week. I'm sure there's been times where you either negotiated a deal or dispute, whether it's at work or in your family or whatever. So one definition from the dictionary is a formal discussion between people who are trying to reach an agreement. What's wrong with that definition? Can the other groups hear you? Can the other classes hear you? Okay. Yeah, what if it's not a formal discussion? So if I'm negotiating and it's kind of informal, does that mean it's not a negotiation anymore? So there's nice things about it, right? Between two people who are trying to reach an agreement, but I think we can all agree that it doesn't have to be formal to be a negotiation. A different definition that I kind of like is the process of seeking a meeting of minds. Again, whether it's a deal or a dispute, we're trying to get on the same page here. And the problem with this, with perspective, is what? If we say negotiation's a meeting of the minds, what happens? What does perspective have to do with this? Yeah.
I think that give you an example. When I got married, my wife and I had very different ideas of how to do things. You know, cooking a meal together or how we did something was strongly influenced by, you know, previous life experiences. My experiences growing up in my family, hers, and we had to kind of not do it my way or her way, per how we were brought up, but our combined way. So sometimes it's, you know, getting two people have very different perspectives or way of interpreting things and getting them to kind of find some common ground.
Okay, good. Yeah, great example. When we have different perspectives, it's hard to have this meeting of minds, right? Because I see it differently than you. And if we need to have this meeting of minds, somehow I either need to take your perspective, you take mine, or, as you point out, find some way where we're either combining perspectives or something, right? But there's got to be some kind of meeting of the minds. And when we have different perspectives, it's hard to do that. That can be a real challenge. So we're going to talk about how do you do that then, which leads us into part 2. Dwight Schrute, McDonald's, and the sexist video. So 3 things we're going to focus on today on how do you increase your capacity to understand somebody else's perspective. First is actively listen. Second is using something called the ladder of inference. And the third is avoiding the single story. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of these. And then, like I said, if we have time, we'll put some of them into practice. So we're going to watch a short clip where Dwight Schrute is demonstrating how to listen actively.
It is crucial that you listen, Dwight. Also, you want to respect their... Are you listening now?
Yes.
Okay, well, you have to show us.
That's impossible. Listening happens in the ear and in the brain. I mean, some organisms have external hairs that vibrate to indicate auditory stimulation, but unfortunately, our external hairs don't vibrate at all.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
What are you doing?
A little smile and a nod shows that I hear you. Got it?
Kind of.
Nellie, why don't you tell Dwight what we were doing earlier today, and Dwight, you show us that you're listening.
Well, we were in the warehouse where we were discussing the murals that I've commissioned Pam to paint there. We were talking about the colour schemes and the major themes we want to hit. Children of the world coming together, cutting down trees to make paper, but not in a child laboury way.
It's just up and down. Just a regular nod, like a person.
I am a person.
Of
Yes.
course, you're a personal.
Yeah.
We can do this, all right? And then we thought I can't carry on with that face. Look at it, I'm going to get nightmares with that face. I mean, he looks like he is labouring over a stool having just eaten human flesh.
It's a bit extreme.
No, I'm sorry, but that is true.
He's screwed. The meeting's in less than an hour.
Okay. Okay, so there are ways that we can listen better. We don't have to be like Dwight. And your previous speaker, Brandon, I didn't catch, I only saw the last 5 minutes of his presentation, but it sounds like he talked about the importance of listening. That was one of his 7 elements of effective negotiation. It's hard to overstate how important listening is. And we're so bad at it. We're so bad. even if we agree and we know that it's important, right? I mean, I teach this stuff all the time, and I still have a really hard time listening effectively, even though I know it. I know like the right steps, all of that. It's hard, but it's so important when we talk about trying to understand somebody's perspective. Active listening is really, really important. The opposite of active listening is passive listening, and some of those behaviors include this phrase: I understand what you're saying, but what's wrong with that?
Negates basically everything. So it just basically negates everything that you were saying that they claim to be hearing you.
What negates it? That's
well, the but.
The but does, right?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but then they don't.
Yeah, and this phrase, I mean, people say it because they think they want to convey that they understand, right? We're having this, you and I disagree. We don't share a perspective. You're explaining your point of view. And then I pull out this phrase after you're done. Oh, I understand what you're saying, and then I make my argument. In the history of your life, have you ever felt understood when someone said that? No, you haven't, right? You don't feel understood. All you feel like is, oh, here it comes, right? No one feels understood when you say that, and yet that's what we're trying to do. People use that because they think, okay, I need to make sure they feel like I understand them. And whether we do or not is kind of beside the point. You don't feel understood if I say that to you, even if I get it. And most of the time I don't. I think I do, but I likely don't. So don't say that ever. It's never helpful. Don't say I understand, show you understand. And we'll talk in a minute about how you can show that. And as she pointed out, but just kind of negates everything that goes before it. But one of the most common but worthless phrases ever is this: I understand what you're saying, but. Preparing our response. So what is that like? What is that about?
This is Tim in Salt Lake. It's where while they're talking, you're thinking of what you're gonna say already, and you've stopped listening to them basically.
Yeah, because I've kind of made this judgment that I know what they're saying, right? I understand what they're saying. So I just need to get this really effective response. So I'm not really listening. I'm just kind of waiting until they finish talking, so then I can get my point in. Good. And then the third is spacing out. What does that sound like? An example.
An example would be something like, "Oh, what did you say?" Or "Could you repeat that?"
Okay.
Or just
good.
Looking off into space and not even paying attention at all.
So outwardly, I have to come around and confess, what did you say, right? Inwardly, I mean, my mind could be anywhere, right? Do we have enough meatloaf for the in-laws? Something just way off topic. Very common for our mind to be wandering while somebody else is talking, right? So these are common passive listening behaviors, and what we're trying to do is get away from that. If you want to understand somebody's perspective, you have to know how to effectively listen. This isn't going to get us there. So 3 important components of active listening. One is to paraphrase. So what does a paraphrase sound like?
This is Tim in Salt Lake. So if I'm understanding you right, you want me to give an example of how to paraphrase.
Perfect. Yes, thank you, Tim. Okay, paraphrase. I'm stating back in my own words what I think I just heard you say. Why is that helpful? Because sometimes it might sound kind of formulaic or something, right? You say something, I kind of repeat it back. Might sound a little robotic or something. Why might that be helpful? Yeah.
Sometimes people's perspectives are different, so if you repeat it, you can kind of understand where someone else is coming from, and if you have a miscommunication, it kind of clears it up.
Yeah, and it's a check, right? Because if I state it back the way I understand it, it gives you a chance to respond. And I was thinking of an example. So I worked in Boston for several years, and I was a mediator. And mediation is a facilitated negotiation, right? I'm a neutral party, and I'm working with two people trying to facilitate a negotiation between them. So I was doing this case. I was in a small claims court, and there were two dog owners, and one woman had two big dogs, and the other woman had a small dog, and they were in a dog park one day, and the two big dogs caused some damage to the small dog, and the woman who owned the small dog incurred a lot of medical costs for the injuries caused by the bigger dogs. So as the owner of the big dogs was telling her story about what happened, I went to restate, and I said, okay, so the dogs were in the park, and then your dog attacked the smaller dog. And she immediately just jumped in and said, no, they didn't attack the smaller dog. They were playing roughly with the small dog, which was really interesting because suddenly I have this insight into what's important to this woman, right? She sees her dog, she loves her dogs, and she doesn't want her dogs seen as dogs that attack. They play roughly. They're not mean dogs, right? But by paraphrasing what I understood, to me, initially I wasn't making any distinction there. They attacked the dog. I mean, she wasn't disputing they actually caused the damage, right? But the way we characterized it was important. And that was really helpful for me to understand her perspective on this, right? So paraphrasing gives you a chance to do that. I state it back and give you a chance to say, yeah, that's it. Or, no, it's not quite right. Or, you get a chance to re-articulate it if I've gotten it wrong. Inquire. So I'm asking open-ended questions to make sure I have all the information. This requires you to stop and think. Usually, especially if we're in a conflict, we make assumptions about the other party's views, and we don't stop to ask questions because we think I have all the information I need. I know what's going on here. In reality, there may be stuff we don't know, right? And when we stop and ask open-ended questions, that gives us a chance to get more information that may change how we look at the situation. And then the last one is to acknowledge. So what we're doing here is we're acknowledging feelings. I don't have to agree to show I understand. I was thinking of a case. One of the things I did when I was living in Boston, I did criminal defense work, and I did appeals. So a lot of my clients, almost all my clients, had been found guilty at trial, and they wanted to appeal, and I was getting their case. And one guy, and so you get a lot of horrible things. My clients have done horrible things. They've been found guilty of doing these horrible things, right? One guy was in prison for a drug crime, and he had a new cellmate, and they were out in some common area in the prison, and my client and a friend of his in prison were talking, and the new cellmate came up and said to the friend of my client, he said, hey, so what are you doing hanging out with this punk? Kind of joking, right? And my client got really mad about that, and he explained to me that in that prison, calling somebody a punk is like the most offensive thing you can do. That's the most insulting thing. And who would know that, right, if you're new to the prison? Sounds harmless enough to those outside the prison, but apparently in the prison context, that was really offensive. So he said they get back to their cell, and he said to his friend, hey, you need to apologize for calling me a punk in front of my friend. He says, no, I would, just joking. I don't mean anything by it. And my client is insisting on getting an apology. And the other guy doesn't apologize, so my client proceeds to just beat him up really, really badly. And I saw photos of this, and it was just horrible, like the way he beat this guy. And he told the guy to go tell the prison medical people that he had just fallen off of his bunk, which, if you'd seen the pictures, just looked ridiculous. The idea that this guy had just fallen off his bunk and had sustained these injuries was really ridiculous. So I'm in the position where I have to listen to his story. Right? I sit down and meet with him, and he wants to appeal his case, and I have to listen. I don't agree with anything this guy has done, right? And remember, he's been found guilty. This isn't, me trying to prove that he's innocent. This is me seeing if there's anything wrong that happened at trial. So I'm listening to his story, and it's really hard because I think what he's done is a horrible thing, and yet he's my client, and I have an obligation to represent him well and effectively. This stuff was really important, right? As he's telling his story. I can say, okay, so it sounds like punk is a really offensive term in this prison. Is that right? Yeah, punk's like the worst word you can ask. Inquire. So I'm stopping and asking open-ended questions. So you're really mad because he called you a punk. Were there other reasons that you got angry? That's giving a chance to give more information, right? And then acknowledge is saying, sounds like you've done a lot of work to get respect in this prison, and then you felt like he's disrespecting you in front of, at least one other person. And, if I was in that situation where I felt like I'd earned a lot of respect and somebody was disrespecting me, I think I might feel angry and frustrated too. Remember, I'm acknowledging it. I don't agree that he should then beat the guy up, right? But I can acknowledge the emotion and feeling. So paraphrase, inquire, acknowledge. There's all kind of tips about active listening. I mean, if you Google active listening, everybody's got ideas for how to do it effectively. I think focusing on these three things is a manageable way of going about thinking about it. How to listen better. Okay. All right. One of my favorite things is the ladder of inference. Ladder of inference is a really simple tool that helps you understand somebody's perspective better. And this is how it works. You have down here this pool of information. And think of the pool of information as all of the information available in the world. Anything that ever happens anywhere is the pool. At any given moment, we only have access to some very small piece of that. So we can see and hear what's happening in our immediate surroundings. We don't know what's going on, halfway around the world. So we only have access to a small piece of the info. So the first step of the ladder is our observations. So the piece of the info that we have access to, what I see, what I hear. The second step is my interpretation of number one. So I see and hear something, and then I interpret it. And the way I interpret something depends on all kinds of stuff. It might depend on my my race, my gender, my culture, my religion. All kinds of things can go into affecting how I interpret what I observe. And then the third step is I come to some conclusion. This is just a basic process of how our mind works, right? We see something, we interpret it, and then we come to some conclusion about it. Now, in a conflict, you'll find that everybody's at their third step, right? They've reached some conclusion. I've reached a conclusion, and so have you. And those clash. Okay? My conclusion does not mesh with your conclusion. And typically we sit there and argue about those things, right? Like, you see blue, black dress, I see white, gold dress, we argue. You see young woman, I see old woman, we argue, right? That's our conclusion. And what the ladder suggests is instead of sticking on your conclusion and sitting there fighting about it, walk down the ladder and find out, how did we get to the third step? How did we get there in the first place? Because at any point along the way, we could diverge. I might have seen something different than you saw. We might have been in the same place, but I'm looking at A and you're looking at B. And so that leads us to a very different conclusion, right? If I'm looking at A, I interpret it one way and come to a conclusion. You look at B, you come to a different conclusion, right, as you go up the ladder. Even if we see the same thing, we might interpret it differently based on our different life experiences. We're all very different, so we might interpret the same thing differently and come to different conclusions. And the really great thing about the ladder is it's not suggesting that you will, at the end of the day, agree with me. There's all kinds of issues where we will have fundamental disagreements with other people. But at least I can understand how you got there. And typically, we don't have that piece of it when we have different perspectives. I don't understand you really, and you don't understand me. And that becomes a problem. And we typically waste a lot of time arguing at the third step of the ladder when we should spend more time walking back down, figuring out how we got there. So I want to show you the ladder in action with a few different examples here. So this is where we're seeing the same thing, right? The first step of the ladder is the same. We both saw the same thing, but we have different reasoning in how we look at it. So here's our three steps. Observations is first step of the ladder. Reasoning is second. Our conclusion is third. So gay marriage just became legal in Utah. So one person might see that, and they might say, my religion teaches that gay marriage is bad for families, and so they conclude society will be harmed with this new law. Another person sees the exact same thing, right? Gay marriage just became legal in Utah. Extending marriage rights to gay people improves equality. Society will be improved with this new law. Opposite conclusions, same exact observation, but because of religion or life experience or whatever, we come to different conclusions. And again, I don't have to agree, whether I'm this person or that person, I don't have to agree with you. But I can spend more time figuring out why you came to your conclusion, right? And it might, okay, and then the other example I wanted to show you is where we're looking at different things, even though we have the same interpretation and come to a different conclusion. So here's our 3 steps again. McDonald's serves food very quickly for customer convenience. That's one thing I might observe. Good restaurants do what's best for their customers, so McDonald's is a good restaurant. Somebody might have that line of thought, right? Another person looks at something different. They say McDonald's uses low-quality ingredients that are unhealthy. Same reasoning, good restaurants do what's best for their customers, but comes to a completely opposite conclusion. You see how that works? That makes sense? So the idea behind the ladder is just this mental construct, really. But when you're in a negotiation situation, you're trying to understand somebody else's perspective, walk down the ladder. Walk back down and think, what's happening here? Do we have the same information? Are we looking at the same stuff? Because if we're not, we need to have that conversation. I need to make sure that we're all looking at the same thing. Good restaurants, the reasoning part, right? Maybe we see the same thing, right? We make sure we're on the same page. And then we just realize, hey, you have a different life experience than I do. Tell me more about that, right? I want to understand, like, you're growing up and what led you to believe the way you do and have that kind of interpretation. Again, I may not agree, but I can understand you. I don't have to start, because if I don't understand that, then I'm left with very few options, and they're not good about you, right? Either you're not very smart, or you're evil, or whatever. But usually, if I don't understand that, then my options for what I'm judging you to be are really not great and not helpful. It's not going to help if I'm trying to have some meeting of the minds to think those things about you. Any questions about how that works, the ladder? Okay, so we talked active listening. We've talked using the ladder. The final thing is called avoiding the single story.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, sorry, there was a question.
Have you ever seen same data, same reasoning, and different conclusion?
Sorry, say that again.
Have you run into situations where they have the same data, they may have the same reasoning, but they have a different conclusion?
Well, that's an interesting question. So 1 and 2 are the same, and they still come to a different conclusion?
Yeah,
I don't know. I can't think of an example off the top of my head. Can anybody think of a time when? I mean, I'm not sure that that's. If you see the same thing and you interpret it the same way, I don't know that you could come to a different conclusion. But I'm open to the possibility. I'm not sure I've ever seen that. Can anybody think of an example where that's the case?
This is Tom and Logan, and yeah, I can think of one. And it has to do with interpreting statistics. And I remember us reading a book on something about numbers, and it was data about President Clinton's popularity, and the data showed that the popularity was dropping, and 2 newspaper articles came out with the exact same graph, and one said Clinton's popularity is dropping, his presidency is turning sour, or something like that. And the other one said, despite tough resistance, President Clinton's popularity is remaining, reasonably high. So they came to different conclusions, exact same data.
Right. So I think that's a good example, but I would suggest that they're interpreting it differently, right? Same data, but different interpretation. And I think the question was, what if you interpret it, you see the same thing, and you interpret it the same way? So using your example, it would be they're looking at the same poll. They're both interpreting it that Clinton is doing well, and then somehow, I don't know, they would come to some conclusion that was different than each other.
I see.
Does that make sense? So I don't know. I'd like to think that through more. I mean, I don't know that it's possible if you really have the same information and you really are interpreting it the same way. Can you come to a different conclusion? I'm not sure. If anybody has other thoughts on that, let me know, because I think it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it.
This is Kyle from Logan. Maybe I'll give you a little more background. We'll go down the bottom of the ladder a little bit. I mean, I see some people that are maybe a little bit pessimistic, and some are optimistic, and maybe a little bit, like Tom was saying, interpreting data. You can have the same data, maybe the same reasoning, but in the end, you look at things more negatively, another person more positively, so you're going to have a different result possibly. That's still interpretation. I put that in.
I would again suggest that if I'm pessimist and you're optimist, that we're interpreting it differently, right? Because I'm interpreting it through my pessimistic lens and you're interpreting it through your optimistic lens.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I think that, yeah, you answered my question. It's what I was getting at would fall under interpretation, stays in the middle there. And
okay. Okay. Thank you for that. So the final, this third point is avoiding the single story. So we're going to watch about 5 minutes of a TED Talk by this woman, and she is a Nigerian author, and she's going to talk about what, well, she's going to explain some of her personal experience with this idea of something called the single story.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music, and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African.
Okay, we'll stop there. So as you watch this, what is your sense then of what the single story is? What is that about?
So this is Adam and Logan. A single story seems to be a stereotype, but how do you weigh a single story versus stereotypes that we have to build to understand the business world that we're going to operate in?
Okay, good question. Let me direct that to the rest of the class. How do you account for single story and also doing effective business with other people?
This is Scott in Rexburg. I think you have to go in with the idea that yeah, you've got the data that you have at that moment, but with the understanding that there's more out there, and that if you'll go out there and actively seek that out, you'll be a better negotiator, you'll be a better businessman, you'll be whatever it is that you're doing, as long as you're trying to find that additional data point, because a single data point doesn't give direction, whereas 2 or 3 would give you a lot of definition.
Okay, good, thanks. Other thoughts on that? Talking about stereotypes and culture negotiation is can be a semester-long class in and of itself. A couple of thoughts I had, just some examples that address this. There was a U.S. business guy meeting with the head of MTV Japan, and in preparing for this meeting, he thought, I want to make sure that I'm culturally sensitive. So using, stereotypes that are reasonable, he learned, a polite Japanese greeting, and so he's meeting this guy in New York City in some fancy hotel, and as he approaches the Japanese exec from MTV, the U.S. guy bows deeply and greets this guy in Japanese, and the Japanese guy kind of looked at him and says, "What's up with that, man?" And I'm sympathetic to the business guy, and so it's this awkward exchange, right? And I'm sympathetic to the business guy. He's trying to do what's right, but I think he's relying on a single story that Japanese people are all going to expect some, Japanese greeting. This is the polite way of doing it, and it's part of the risk of relying on stereotypes. And I think your point was, stereotypes can be helpful, and absolutely, right? I mean, we can't completely ignore stereotypes. They come from somewhere. I think an interesting or maybe helpful statement about stereotypes is an analogy to the weather. Relying on weather reports is helpful, right? You can plan your day around it, but they're often wrong, and you need to be prepared for the time when they're wrong. So, I think it's helpful to be thinking about how stereotypes can be useful. But I think the helpful thing about the single story is it's acknowledging up front stereotypes can be useful. Often they're reliable, and often they're wrong. And so I need to be open to a different story about this other person, right? I had an experience in a law school class a couple years ago. I used to, in fact, talking about active listening, one of the things we talked about is not, listening and not trying to fix the problem. And there's this video clip that many of you have probably seen of this, maybe it's a guy and his wife, or or boyfriend and girlfriend, whatever, but she has a nail in her head. You guys seen this? And they're talking as, she's describing how much pain she's in, and he points out that she has a nail in her head and she should remove it. And she tells him it's not about the nail. So they're kind of, the clip is, kind of relying on these sort of gender stereotypes about, women want to talk about emotions, the guys wanting to try to fix things. And it was kind of this perfect clip for illustrating the point we were trying to make. So I show the clip, and almost everybody in the class laughs. And then one female student raises her hand and said, "Can you try making this point in a way that's not so sexist?" And immediately I felt really defensive, because I consider myself somebody who's not sexist and reasonably sensitive to gender issues. And so instead of reacting, thankfully, I didn't react the way I was feeling inside. I asked if I could meet with her after class. And the single story I had was, this is a funny clip, and it's really fitting, and she is just overly sensitive. That's my story of her. And when I sat down with her, I was really shocked and surprised to find that I ended up agreeing that I shouldn't show the clip. And some of you who have seen it will probably think, no, that's just ridiculous. You should show the clip. She's being overly sensitive. I promise you, that's what I thought too. But as I sat down with her and heard and was open to another story, and I was, even though going into it I had this kind of single story of, I'm pretty sure I know what this is about, I was really pleasantly surprised. And I think if you're open to other stories, you're in for a lot of pleasant surprises. But when we don't, when we think we have it all figured out, and especially when we're in a conflict, when it's emotional, we close ourselves off from the possibility of even learning about that, right? So my recommendation on learning more about this single story, being open to multiple stories, is don't get mad, because we tend to get mad or defensive or frustrated or whatever when we have some different perspective. When somebody has a perspective and we have this single story, don't get mad, get curious. If you can take a position of curiosity, it is so liberating. So somebody can be saying something, and in your mind you're thinking, I totally disagree with this person. And think of any issue that gets you going, right? I mean, with the San Bernardino shootings recently, the gun stuff is the gun debate emerges again. Whatever side of that debate you're on, think about arguing with somebody who you really disagree with, whose position you really disagree with. And then try, instead of getting mad about it, try getting curious. And you might think, even as we're talking about this right now, sitting here in the classroom, no, I know what those people are about, right? Whether they're pro-gun or anti-gun. I know what those people are about. I've heard the arguments. The minute you start thinking that, stop yourself, pull back, and get curious. No, I've heard this debate. I've had this debate with a lot of people. I've read a lot of pros and cons on each side. I'm pretty sure I know what this is about, but I'm going to stop and I'm going to try and listen. I'm going to try and see if there's another story here that I'm not aware of. Doesn't mean you're going to agree. You might still be really strongly on one side or the other of the issue, but at least you can better understand where people are coming from. And if we don't do that, we're going to be stuck. You're not going to have a meeting of the minds, right? And again, whether that's trying to get a deal or trying to resolve a dispute, it's really, really hard. And it can be in your personal life, professional life, wherever, whatever the case is. If you're not open to multiple stories, it's really hard to have that meeting of the minds to really understand somebody else's perspective.